Designing user-friendly interfaces has increased in priority, which means having a UX or user experience designer. However, there are companies that still struggle to justify the work of a UX designer. And even those who get it struggle to hire and work with UX designers, given how young the field is and how it's constantly evolving. Well, in today's episode of Build, we'll dive into the role and how to overcome some of these hurdles when it comes to hiring and working with UX designers. So stay tuned. Welcome to Build, the show that debunks a number of myths and misconceptions related to building products, companies, and your career in tech. I'm your host, Purnima Vijay Shankar. It's hard to argue that designing user-friendly interfaces is important, and as a result, UX design or user experience design is gaining in popularity. However, there are still some companies that struggle to understand what a UX designer does, how they add value, and how to go about hiring and vetting them, and how they can work with existing product teams of software engineers and product managers effectively. Well, in today's episode, we're going to tackle some of these myths around UX design, and in the next episode, we'll dive into what user experience designers can do to stand out, how companies can go about hiring and vetting them, and how they can work effectively with software designers and product managers. And to help us out, I've invited Sarah Doody, who is a UX designer and an entrepreneur based in New York City. Thanks for joining us today, Sarah.
Thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
You have done a lot for the community of UX designers, and I want to get to all of that. But before we dive in, tell us how you got into UX design.
To be totally honest, I didn't even know that user experience existed, that it was a thing back when I was, thinking about my future, choosing colleges and things like that. But what I knew was that I really loved science and I really loved creativity. And so I actually applied to a program back in Ottawa, Canada, a neuroscience program, and got accepted because I thought it kind of had that interesting balance. Long story short, I ended up taking a year off, learned a little bit about web design, and kind of the rest is history. I worked in a little web design firm, learned about web design, graphic design, coding, things like that. But the realization of UX for me was one day when we kind of launched this thing, and I thought to myself, this is not what we talked about in the beginning. And that's when someone gave me the book by Lou Rosenfeld with the polar bear on it. I forget the name of it. I think it's Information Architecture for the World Wide Web. And I read it and I thought to myself, this is what I need to do. And then many, many years later, I've self-taught myself, and I really focused in on that element of experience design. So the research, the user flows, the wireframes, the prototype, what do we build bucket of kind of UX roles that are under that huge growing field.
What made you decide to go specifically into UX? Because you mentioned you had done a lot of different things. You had done some coding, you had done some product work. So why hone in on that area?
So I think I really liked the combination of still technical and creativity. I would never tell anyone I would code their website today, but I know enough to be what I call technically literate, which I think is so important for UX designers today, because you need to be able to have those conversations with developers or with the product manager who's probably technically literate as well. So for me, it was that perfect combination. And I guess to take it a step further, I chose not to also do kind of the visual side of UX, because I knew that my skills were better in the kind of strategy, experience, and research side of things.
Got it. Okay, I know we're going to dive into some of those best practices that you already mentioned in the next episode. So let's talk about how you work with companies and UX designers.
Sure. So for the bulk of my career, so in 2012, I launched my own UX design consultancy, and I really focused in on kind of two types of companies: either the company that was just starting out and needed someone to help them figure out what should we build, is this actually a viable idea, and work with them to maybe make that MVP, or companies that were already launched and realized kind of, uh-oh, not working as planned, and helping them optimize key user flows. So maybe it was their sign up process or the free trial or the checkout. Like I call them kind of like major conversion user flows. And so for about 6 years, I focused exclusively on that. But kind of in parallel, I started to really become interested in UX education. And I co-created and taught the first 11-week program at General Assembly, 11-week UX program. And that really opened my eyes to education. So now my business is probably 50-50 split between education and still consulting. And I would say I don't ever see myself stopping that consulting, because honestly, I wouldn't feel comfortable teaching it if I wasn't doing it right. So it also gives me tons of great feedback and stories to give to my students and things like that. So that's where my business is right now. But I mean, who knows where it'll be in 2 years, because I never thought I'd be doing the education side of things if you told me, 2 or 3 years ago.
And in terms of the companies that you work with, are you still doing sort of the early stage versus the larger companies that need help with their workflows and the optimization that you talked about?
Yeah, it's still, so I've kind of decided I'm not going to choose, a specific type of customer for the consulting. I like both stages. I've worked at both stages, like as an internal employee as well. So I don't really specialize in either. I have a couple of startups that I'm working with right now, working on things exactly like the sign up trial we discussed, or conversions, and then existing clients, same thing, digging into, like zooming into a really specific part of their business. And in a large company, those UX changes could have huge impacts, such as like reducing amount of time that call center employees need to be on the phone. So the downstream effects of UX are huge. And I know we're going to be talking about that as well.
Definitely. Yeah, we'll come back to that difference between the early stage startups versus the bigger company. So let's dive right in. One of the misconceptions that I run into is people confusing UX design with visual or graphic design. And as you already mentioned, you specifically chose UX versus visual. So tell us, how are these roles all different?
Sure. So I say this to my students. I say this to people who ask me, for help hiring, that you have to think of UX kind of like a big umbrella with a lot of roles underneath it. And we could debate all day long all those roles underneath. But to me, there's two kind of main buckets, let's say. There's what I call the experience design side of things and the visual design side of things. And lumped into that experience design side of things, people would do things like research or information architecture or content strategy or experience design, meaning, if we want to get to specific deliverables, just so we're crystal clear, things like user flows, customer journey maps, wireframes, prototypes, things like that. And then the visual side of things is taking what that experience team does and applying the visual, right? So making it match the branding, or sometimes coming up with that branding, thinking through, round corners, square corners, what shade of blue, all those details that we need to think about, typography. And I know it's frustrating because almost every day I get the question, well, what does a UX designer really do? And honestly, it varies from company to company, because if you think a smaller company probably has a smaller budget, so they want that person that can do everything. But a large company, like Amazon or Wayfair or something, they probably have very, very narrow siloed roles. So you have to think about that if you're hiring or if you're the person applying as well. And the other thing I would point out too, there is a distinction between that visual designer versus a graphic designer. And again, semantics, but companies need to be aware that graphic design, before digital, was really about print and things like that, or logos or typography. And so you kind of have to be a little careful, because with the popularization of UX, a lot of people are throwing UX into their like bullet list of skills, but maybe they've been a graphic designer for 15 years and don't have that experience with digital. And that's very different than designing print things. So that's a distinction you really have to be just cautious about.
Yeah, I know I learned that lesson the hard way in my last book,
Yes.
where I had somebody design a cover and quickly realized that this person didn't have a lot of print experience and needed to go find somebody that did. So
Yeah.
those things are very nuanced, and it's interesting how the skill sets can vary. So important to kind of test it out, have those conversations as you're kind of figuring out who you want to hire and the type of work that needs to be done. So great point mentioning that.
Yes.
Now, another thing that you mentioned, and I know is a concern, is a UX designer wanting to do something like user research or, a myriad of things. And when a company takes a look at that, they might be concerned, thinking, oh, you know what, we already know who our users and our customers are. We just want to come in and have somebody build the product. So how would you tackle this sort of concern?
Right. So user research is such a contentious topic in companies because, to your point, there's this fear that it's going to slow things down, that it might also, negate the beliefs, maybe even the founding beliefs of the actual company. And then, especially with a startup, sometimes there's just such an emotional attachment to the idea. So I always tell people that you have to flip it in your mind from thinking about user research as a big expense to actually an investment. And the thinking behind that is that, and I say this not just from thinking, but also from seeing so many companies come to me who did not do research. And to your point earlier, realizing, we launched something and no one wants it. Or now we're spending all this marketing money making little cute videos to try and convince people they need it. And it's like, the world doesn't need more of your cute, how-to videos. You just need to do the research to build a better product. So by investing in that research up front, your teams are going to be more likely to actually build that thing that people want, and you won't be kind of crossing your fingers and hope that when you press launch, they actually need that thing. And it really goes to the idea of reducing that kind of convincing factor after you launch, reducing that rework factor that, if you've ever worked in product, you've probably experienced, and just having clearer messaging to your potential customers about what's the one promise that your product can offer people.
Yeah, that's a good point. And this actually dovetails into my next question, being that people are reluctant to hire these designers, UX designers, because they don't want to change their product development process. They feel like it's working, right? Supposedly working. So how would you tackle this as well?
So I think if companies are worried that research is going to slow them down and that a designer is going to come in and, force them into all these, I don't know, creative meetings with Post-it notes and things like that, I would say and it's cliche, but I think you have to kind of have baby steps into introducing design into your company. And one of the best recommendations I would make is that you want to not just have your team, your product team, let's say, kind of point the finger and say, okay, that's the designer. If I were leading a product team, I would want to kind of ingrain in everyone's mind that they have the opportunity to influence design, and we all need to be thinking like a designer. And the way to do that is to not kind of silo off the designer into, the creative room or something like that, but involve the developers, involve the product managers, involve everyone in that design process, so that it doesn't feel like the designer is kind of telling them what to make, but it's more of a collaborative process. And this also helps with a problem that I find a lot of companies have, is that issue of, pushback once maybe you've got to version 3 of the prototype or something. If you can have everyone kind of co-designing along the way, then you hopefully address those concerns or pushback far sooner in the product development process. And another thing would be, if you're involving everyone way earlier, then that handoff period I find goes a lot smoother because you're not relying on people maybe reading tons of documentation because it's already been kind of a discussion point for X number of weeks. And then that documentation can maybe be lighter and just focus on, the more complex parts of the actual product or feature.
Yeah, and I know we're going to dive into that in the next episode. So
Yeah.
let's keep that in mind. And finally, I know that people are concerned around the value that a UX designer brings. You've already mentioned a couple things, and you've mentioned how companies really need to think about this as an investment rather than a cost or something that's going to slow them down. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more around what the exact value is.
Sure. So trying to calculate the ROI of UX is something, if you Google that, you get so many articles and opinions and things. And I was giving a talk somewhere, I can't remember where, but I stumbled upon this organization called the Design Management Institute, I think. Maybe we can link to it.
Yeah.
But anyway, they've been around for a while and they really wanted to try and help quantify the value of design. So what they did was they set up a study where they selected, I think it was 10 or 15 companies, and put them into this thing they called the Design Value Index. And these were companies that were very much forward thinking in design. And some of them off the top of my head, I think there was Nike, IBM, Starbucks, maybe IKEA, but companies that are, Coca-Cola. Anyway, they tracked them over I believe it was a 10-year period. And they found that those companies outperformed the S&P 500 by something like 200%. And so there's much more research if you want to kind of geek out on all this. But when you see numbers like that consistently year after year over 10 years, it's hard to deny that there's value in investing in design. Mm-hmm. IBM is also a great company to look at because they have the IBM design thinking process or something like that. And they've tracked internally the time to complete really large projects. Maybe they take a year, and long projects, maybe 3 years or something. And they quantify in their reports, the value of design, even down to, I think, like profit per employee and things like that, which is remarkable.
That's really cool.
Like there's definitely the monetary side of things.
Right.
And then I think like when you look at the experience design or experience side of things for the actual customer, those companies that invest in design, and we kind of touched on it earlier, I find, and I don't have numbers around this, but anecdotally, I find that they have to spend less time doing that rework. They spend less time kind of spinning their wheels on marketing and coming up with the how-to videos, the FAQs, the different landing pages, the messaging, et cetera, because when your product is well designed and not just visually, I think people kind of jump to that visual design side of things. But when I think of design, I think, does the product solve a problem? And is that really clear from the moment someone, sees whatever ad you have on Facebook or your landing page or something like that? So you can really reduce a lot of those marketing expenses as well by focusing on the design of the product, not just what it looks like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So the actual experience of the product.
Exactly.
So now let's talk about the top 3 benefits of having a UX designer on your team from the very beginning, right before you start building the product.
Sure. So I think the first one for me is making sure that you're building the right thing, because hopefully that UX designer will either conduct research, or sometimes, I guess here's a little tip. Sometimes if you honestly don't have the time or budget for research, or you have a founder or a stakeholder who's just said, no, like you're fired if you do any research.
Yeah.
What I would do is I would say, go do research that doesn't involve money or too much of your time. And by that, I mean, go scour social media. For example, like reviews in the iTunes store or app store. of similar apps, or go do some simple Google searches, go see what people are writing about other products. That's a great way to just do some really light research. So make sure you're building the right thing. Second benefit to having someone else or a UX designer on your team, obviously profits. I know it's repetitive, but I can't deny the numbers that came out of that study. And companies like IBM and Nike and Starbucks, et cetera, you see the value of it. And then the third one, I think, could be controversial, but I'll say it anyway. So a lot of people ask me if I think the role of a UX designer is going away. And the thinking behind that is, there's so many tools out there that let someone run a user test or make a wireframe. It's like, well, what do you need me for anymore? And my thinking is everyone on your team really has the ability to be a designer, even if design is not on their title. As you know, right? You've done design as well. Your title is not designer. So we still need the UX designers on the team to kind of evangelize design, educate people, because it's easy to move things around on the screen and make UX deliverables. But I guess, like, going off kind of the mantra of my whole business, I'm all about helping people learn how to think like a designer. And so I think UX designers today should be really thinking about how can they not just like execute deliverables, but educate the other people on their teams so that they're thinking about design as well.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Go ahead.
And I think, I don't know this for sure, but I think, looking at those companies in that design value index, the Nikes, the Starbucks, et cetera, I think they've really done a good job at cultivating, a culture of design. And I imagine that's because there's a lot of designers internally and executives who are, evangelizing and investing and educating in designing, not just people with design in their title, but everyone who's touching the experience, really.
No, that makes sense. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing some of these benefits, as well as helping us debunk a number of misconceptions around UX design.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to have chatted with you.
Well, that's it for this episode of Build. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to receive the next episode, where Sarah and I are going to dive into some best practices for hiring and vetting designers, as well as how you can work effectively with software engineers and product managers. Ciao for now. Build is brought to you by amazing patrons. Our Platinum patrons are Andrea Goulet, CEO and co-founder of Corgi Bites; Charbel Saman, founder of Sprintwell; Dee Gill, founder of Chime On; Jamie Hand; and Lauren Hassan, CEO and founder of Developer, as well as the following patrons. If you'd like to join them and support Build, please visit patreon.com/build. In exchange for your support, you'll receive perks like advanced copies of our books from authors highlighted on the show, special pricing on upcoming Femgineer courses, and more. Welcome to Femgineer's Confident Communicator course introductory video series. I'm Purnima Vijay Shankar, the founder of Femgineer.
And I'm Karen Catlin, a former tech executive who's now an advocate for women who are working in the tech industry.
For the last 22 years, I have been speaking in public, and for the last 8 within the tech industry. I have given a TEDx talk, I've been a guest lecturer at Duke's Pratt School of Engineering, an entrepreneur in residence at 500 Startups, a mentor in residence at Techstars, and was the founding engineer of Mint.com.
I am on my second career. In my first career, I spent 25 years building software products. I started out as a software engineer and over time moved to the executive level, where I was a vice president at Adobe Systems. Now, in my second career, I'm an advocate for women, which means I do a lot of public speaking about diversity, about women's leadership topics, and I've given a TEDx talk.
The Confident Communicator course is a live online course that Karen and I co-teach together. In this video series, we're going to give you a sense of what the Confident Communicator course is and what you'll get out of it.
You'll learn about the challenges Purnima and I have faced learning the craft of public speaking ourselves. You'll learn why we decided we just couldn't keep all of this knowledge to ourselves, and you'll hear from students who have taken the class about how they have become more confident communicators.
You're going to get a behind-the-scenes look at the entire course. You'll meet some past students and see how they went from being shy and nervous to poised and confident communicators. You're also going to meet employers and sponsors who found the course valuable enough to invest in and send their people. And finally, you'll get some sample lessons so you know the material that we're going to be covering. Sign up below to receive the first lesson immediately, where you'll understand why it's not good enough to just be heads down. You need to speak up to get the recognition you deserve. Ciao for now.